Michael James, thank you so much for joining us today on Transformations to discuss the work of Sri Ramana Maharshi, also known as Bhagavan.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, how did you become involved in the teachings of Ramana Maharshi?
Uh, I don't want to talk much about myself, but very briefly, when I was 19, I went to India looking for something, but not quite knowing what I was looking for. A vague idea, I was looking for something spiritual, but and I was traveling around India for about a year and a half. And while traveling, I heard about him. But I didn't know much about him. So I came to Tiruvannamalai just to find out more. But I was expecting I would stay only a few days. When I came there, I read a translation, probably not a very good translation, but a translation of one of his important writings called Nana. That's Who Am I? And as soon as I read that, I understood this is what I've been looking for. So I stayed, I have a good fortune of living there for the next 20 years. And I was also very soon after uh, coming there, I came into contact with one of his close devotees, disciples, Sadhu Om. And through him, I was able to get a very deep insight into the teachings.
That's great when that happens, when we're
Yeah,
looking for something, we're not sure what, and then something just grabs us by the shirt collar and never lets
yeah.
us go.
Well, yeah. Uh, I can say it all in one word that the incidents don't matter, but ultimately it's all grace, and
Yes. So
we find what we're ready for when we're ready for it.
indeed, then the teachings show up at the right
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
Yeah. So people who are interested in self-inquiry often come across the teachings of Ramana Maharshi.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and what's interesting is that, you know, in discussions on enlightenment, there's people talk about there's gradual ways to enlightenment and there's sudden or instantaneous enlightenment. And
Mm,
at age 16, Bhagawan had a spontaneous, life-altering experience
mm,
of what could be called the death of the ego, or
yeah,
enlightenment, or awakening, or self-realization. How did
yeah.
he describe that occurrence?
Well, he did describe many years later. He did describe it in words, but he made it very clear but no words can adequately express what happened because it happened instantaneously and without any it wasn't a mental process, but he described it in words just to give people an idea of what happened, but he made it very clear that it wasn't a thought process, but it was something much deeper than that. So what he said about it is that he was sitting alone in an upstairs room in the house where he was living at that time. And he was suddenly overwhelmed by an intense fear of death. And I'll just add a little bit in here, and this isn't what he said, but this is my understanding. Normally, if a fear of death comes to us, our mind goes outwards to all the things to which we're attached. For example, we can sometimes hear stories of people who nearly drown. And while they're drowning, they say it's like seeing a, a movie of all the important events in their life going through their mind. This is because the mind the mind goes out towards the things to which it is most attached.
Mm.
So because we are very strongly identified with this body, and therefore with the identity. I am Michael, I am Mark, I am whoever. And because we identify this body, therefore we have parents, we have husband, wife, children, all these relationships. We have friends, we have a career, we may have certain property, we may have money in the bank, or we may have lots of problems. We've got bills to pay, mortgage to, or rent to pay, all these things. So we are totally identified with this, with what we now take ourselves to be. So if the fear of death comes to us, our mind goes out to those things to which it is most attached. What is unusual in the case of Bhagavan, when that fear of death came to him, his mind didn't go outwards. It went within. Because what we fear to lose when the fear of death comes is to lose our identity and
Mm.
everything to which with which we identify ourselves, everything that we take to be I and mine. Whereas in his case, what he was concerned about his very being. Okay, the body is going to die, but when the body dies, do I die? Do I cease to exist when the body ceases to exist? I'll just tell one incident that happened a few years before this. When he was about 12 years old, his father suddenly passed away. And at that time, he was studying in some other town. So when his father passed away, he was quickly brought there. Whereas in India, when someone passes away, they usually cremate within 24 hours. So all the immediate family were informed, and some relative would have brought him there to see his father. So when he came there, he was looking at his father's body, and he was puzzled. He said, "Why is everyone saying father has gone when father is here?" And then some older relative said to him, "If this body were your father, uh, would he not greet you with love and affection? But see, he's just lying here. So your father has left. His body is no longer your father." He was thinking about that very deeply, and he thought, yes, I know the I in me, but my father's I has left his body. I meaning the first person pronoun I. So he recognized at that time that distinction between that which is aware of itself as I and the body which we mistake to be I. So when this fear of death came to him, what he feared to lose was his very being. So rather than his attention going outwards, as would be the reaction of almost all of us, his attention went in to see who am I, to see what he actually is. So he described it in words. He said, "Now this body is dead. It's going to be carried away and cremated. With the death of this body, do I also die?" This is how he described it in words. But he made it very clear that it wasn't actually a reasoning process. It was just a spontaneous response to that fear of death, was his attention turned within to find out what he really is. And it turned within with so much intensity that he subsided and merged back into his eternal being, what
Wow.
he actually is. And that is the annihilation of ego. That is, ego is a false awareness of ourselves. As ego, we're always aware of ourselves as I am this body, I am this person, I am Michael, or I am Mark, or I am whoever. That the name is a name given to this body, which we take to be ourselves. So that which is aware of itself as I am this body, that is ego. But that's a false awareness of ourselves because this body is not what we actually are. So when the fear of death, when the fear of death came to him and his attention turned within, he uh, he that ego subsided and merged back into the underlying reality, what we all actually are, namely the one infinite being. And so the ego is annihilated, so what remained is only that infinite being. The life of that body from then onwards is only in our view. It's only in our view that we see him as a body. What he experienced himself as is uh, is the one eternal, infinite, immutable, pure being, pure awareness, pure happiness, pure love that we all actually are. So from that point onwards, there was no individuality. There was no identification. So though he outwardly appeared to be a person, just like everyone else, what was shining through that body was not an ego. Like when you're talking to me, there's there's an ego here that is aware of all this. So we say the eyes are the window to the soul. So through every pair of eyes, we can see a soul. We can see another uh, uh, individual like us. But in his case, there was no longer any individual there. So what was shining through that outward form is that eternal reality. Call it Brahman, God, Atmasvarupa, whatever we want to call it. It is that one eternal reality.
Hmm. So it's almost like he was seeing in everyone else's eyes himself as that one reality staring back at himself, not himself in the ego sense
Yeah,
of the eye.
well, that is how we explain it.
Yes,
But in his view, there were no others.
right.
That is what we see as multiplicity,
He
he
saw.
saw as oneness.
Right.
Because the ultimate reality is one only without a second. This is a term that occurs in one of the Upanishads. I think the
Right.
Chandogya Upanishad. If I ekam eva advaitiyam, that means one only without a second.
Hmm.
Because that is the ultimate reality is infinite.
Yes.
And there can't be more. Anything, if anything were other than the infinite wouldn't be infinite. So for
Yes.
him, there are no others. So we see him seeing us or seeing others because in our view, we see all this multiplicity. But what we see as multiplicity, he sees as the oneness but we all actually are.
Hmm.
So with our mind, we cannot adequately comprehend his state, comprehend what he is. In order to know him as he knows himself, we need to know ourselves because he is not something other than ourselves. He is our own reality appearing outwardly as if another person.
In the stories of Sri Aurobindo, who had the same realization in prison and going when he was in court, he said he could see Shiva laughing at him from the judge's chamber and Shiva's face in every face of the jurors. And I wonder if there's any stories or writings or recollection of Bhagavan having a similar statement that when you're saying he saw the one in everything, was it like he was seeing that staring back at him in that kind of a similar way?
No, no, no. That is, as I say, we cannot. His state is infinite.
Yeah.
The mind is finite, so the finite mind cannot grasp his state. Whatever experience Aurobindo had, it's some sort of a mystical experience,
Hmm.
but it's still there's an experiencer and something that is experienced. But Bhagavan was beyond that duality of experiencer and experience,
Hmm.
subject and object. He had transcended that duality completely
Yeah.
because that duality is not real. It's an appearance. So long as we rise as ego, we experience ourselves as I am this, and we therefore experience all this multiplicity. But when ego is annihilated, there is no longer that appearance of duality. There is just the, the one infinite Satchidananda.
Satchidananda. Yes. I think he said, or I read that he said that the strongest teaching or the most profound comes through silence,
Yes.
uh, like a silent darshan.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Well, yes, but people often misunderstand what he means by silence. When he talks about silence, he's obviously not talking about vocal silence. He's also not talking about mental silence,
mm,
because these silences come and go. Sometimes our mind may be relatively silent, sometimes it may be relatively agitated. So it is not a silence that comes and goes. It is the eternal silence of pure being. That is, pure being is immutable. So in
mm,
that state of immutability, there's no metaphorical noise at all. The very rising of our self as ego is the first noise. And all this multiplicity, it's all noise. Whereas he is the silence of pure being. And the reason why he said silence is the ultimate teaching, the real teaching, is that the reality cannot be revealed by anything other than itself, because there is nothing other than it. So the nature of reality is infinite and eternal silence, the silence of pure being. So that alone can reveal itself. So of his own accord, he never gave teachings to anyone. Whatever teachings he gave were what were either prompted by circumstances or in answer to people's questions. Because in his view, there is no one who is ignorant, no one who is not aware of themselves. Because there's nothing in his view, there are no others. So he never felt any need to give any teaching. So what the teachings we have are the answers he gave to people's questions. And the answers he gave were appropriate to the questioner, which is why for many years, for
mm,
the first 25 or more years of his living in, after he, as a 16-year-old boy, 6 weeks after that death experience, the annihilation of the ego, his body came to Tiruvannamalai. That is, this happened in Madurai, in a town called Madurai in South India. And he was powerfully attracted to Arunachala, which is the mountain that in Tiruvannamalai. So he came there and he lived, the body lived there for the next 54 years. For the first 25 or more years, people really didn't know what his teachings were. Because though if people asked him questions, he would give up answers appropriate to their questions. The answers he gave depended on the questions people asked. It so happened that very early on, in about 1901 or 1902, a person called Shiva Prakasham Pillai had come and asked him a series of questions. And the first question he asked was, Swami, who am I?
mm,
To which Bhagavan replied, awareness alone is I. And then he asked, what is the nature of that awareness? And he said, Satchidananda. Satchidananda means being, awareness, happiness. That is the description of the ultimate reality. And then Shiv Prakash Pillai asked a series of other questions, and he gave answers. At that time, he was speaking very little, so mostly he gave answers by writing in the sand, on the sandy ground. He would just write the answers. Or sometimes if Shiv Prakash Pillai gave him a chalk and slate, he would write on a slate, or a piece of paper, he would write on a piece of paper. So the answers that Shiv Prakash Pillai collected at that time, he kept for his own benefit, but he had no idea of publishing them. But many years later, around about in the early 1920s, he wrote a Tamil poem, a biography of Bhagavan called
mm,
Ramana Charita Ahava. And he had a nephew who was very close to him. So his nephew decided to publish this. And he wanted to publish these notes that he had made of the conversations he had. So it was only in about 1923 or so, 22 or 23, I can't remember exactly which year it was, that that Nana, this work of Who Am I, was first published in the form of questions and answers as an appendix to this biography.
Mm.
And then only people came to know about this work. And then they asked Shiv Gopinath, are there more answers? So then a slightly more detailed version was published as a book. And then Bhagavan himself rewrote it in the form of an essay because it so perfectly captures the core of his teachings. And at around about the same time, in the early 1920s, a devotee called Muruganar came. And within a few years, Muruganar got him to write three very important works. Firstly, a song called Anma Vide, which is just 5 verses, but the refrain of that is extremely easy, knowing oneself extremely easy. So that was the refrain composed by Muruganar, who was a Tamil poet, and Bhagavan wrote the verses explaining that. So that was one important work. And another one was a work called Upadesha Undiyar, which Bhagavan wrote first in Tamil, and later he translated into Malayalam. I think the order was Telugu, Sanskrit, and then Malayalam. So it's the only work Bhagavan wrote in 4 languages. It's just 30 verses. In Sanskrit and Telugu and Malayalam, it's called Upadesha Sara. I think in Sanskrit it's Upadesha Saraha, in Telugu it's Upadesha Saralu, and in Malayalam it's Upadesha Saram, according to the grammar of each language. But it basically means the essence of instructions. That was in 1927. And in 1928, Muruganar asked Bhagavan to compose 40 verses explaining the nature of reality and the means of attaining it. That became Uladu Napdu, which is a work of 40 verses. So these very, very important works came only because Shiv Prakashan Pillai and Muruganar were they were very mature spiritual aspirants, and they were very well attuned to his teachings. They were able to ask the appropriate questions to get the appropriate teachings. Most people who know about Bhagavan's teachings, they know from various books like Talks and Day by Day, in which devotees recorded conversations that took place. But Bhagavan generally spoke in Tamil. Tamil was his mother tongue. Sometimes if people asked him questions in Telugu or Malayalam, he would reply in those languages. He also could converse in Sanskrit. He composed verses in Sanskrit. He knew English, but generally he spoke English very little. So if people asked him questions, he would reply in Tamil and it would be translated. These people who recorded Talks and Day by Day and Maharshi's Gospel and such books, they recorded what he had said in Tamil in English. So, and they didn't have they weren't using tape recorders, or they weren't taking shorthand then and there. They would hear the conversation, then they would go and record what they remembered. So, but his answers went through 3 filters. Firstly, the filter of their understanding. Because if you listen to a conversation, you will only be able to grasp what you're able to understand. So the first filter it went through was their understanding. The second filter was their memory. Right. Because if you listen to a conversation, how much you can't remember the exact words. You remember the main points that strike you. And the third filter was translation. They didn't think of recording in the actual language, they recorded in English. So these are not, firstly, they're not accurate. Then we can't say they're the exact words of Bhagavan. It's what these people understood and remembered and how they expressed it in English.
So we can
Also,
see the problems that can arise from
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And also, the other main problem is the majority of people who came were not coming just for the annihilation of ego. People come with all sorts of worldly problems, worries, and things, and also with so many preconceived ideas, beliefs. So people were often coming and seeking approval for what they were already doing.
Mm.
So they would ask him questions about puja or japa or dhyana. Puja means worship, japa means repeating a name of God or a mantra, and about meditation, all these things. So he answered the questions according to the question, according to the what was appropriate to the question that was asked. It's recorded in talks. In one place, Swami Yogananda,
Hmm.
who was had gone to America and started the Self-Realization Fellowship, and later wrote his biography called Autobiography of a Yogi. He came to Bhagavan in the mid 1930s, and one question he asked Bhagavan was, "What teachings can be given for the what teachings should be given for the uplift of the masses?" Bhagavan replied, "Teaching cannot be given en masse. Teaching has to be according to the taught."
Mm.
So that very much expresses not only Bhagavan, but all great sages. They give teachings that are appropriate to the people who are asking the question, the people who are seeking guidance. So if it weren't for people like Shiva Prakasham Pillai and Murugana, we wouldn't really know what the core of Bhagavan's teachings were. People
Right.
say, oh, Bhagavan approved all spiritual paths. Yes, in a sense, but in Upadesha Undya or Upadesha Saram, he very clearly explains the efficacy of different paths, and he grades them as which is more efficacious.
Mm.
Because other spiritual paths, they're means to purify the mind. And purification of the mind is very necessary because the impurities in the mind are what are called vasanas or samskaras. That is the inclinations. Very specifically, they're called Vishaya Vasanas. Vishaya means objects of phenomena. So the inclination we have to attend to and to experience Vishayas, objects of phenomena, in other words, anything other than ourselves, these are called Vishaya Vasanas. And the Vishaya Vasanas are the seeds that give rise to likes, dislikes, desires, attachments, hopes, fears, and so on. So long as we have strong Vishaya Vasanas, our mind will always be going outwards. So we will not be willing to turn within and merge back into our source. So these Vishaya Vasanas are the impurities. The aim of any spiritual practice is to purify the mind. In other words, to reduce the strength of those outward going inclinations. For example, the path of bhakti begins with worshipping God as if God were something other than ourselves. So, and it has to be motivated by love because most people who worship God, they're not worshiping God for the sake of God. They worship God for what they can get from God. Majority of people who go to temples or churches or mosques or synagogues or whatever, why do they go there? Because they want something from God. That is, they want good health. They want to be free of problems of life. They want that, but they're concerned about the welfare of their family and everything. This is human nature. So the majority of religious people, for them, God is a means to an end
Mm.
rather than an end in themselves.
And that's
So
not true bhakti, though, right? Like
that,
bhakti
well,
yoga, the
yeah, yeah.
path of
Well,
love.
that is. It, I mean, if we want to fulfill our desires, it's better to rely on God than to rely on cheating your neighbor or whatever. So,
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
it's a step. It's a step on the. It's part of the evolution of the soul. And this evolution of the soul takes place over so many so many lifetimes, and the soul means nothing but ego. So we progress gradually over, we evolve gradually over so many lives. So so long as we want worldly things, we're not really interested in spirituality. As I say, God is a means to an end. He's not an end in himself. But as the mind slowly matures, we begin to develop love for God for the sake of God alone. So when we love God for his own sake, we want to express our love for him. And there are different ways of doing that. Physically, we can do worship of various kinds. There's so many different ritualistic worship, or even if you're doing, say, you're doing service to your neighbors, you're helping those who are in need, you're patiently listening to someone who's telling you their troubles or something. If you do this with the attitude that you're doing it for God, that you take whoever is in need, not to be someone below you, but God has come in that form, and it's an opportunity for you to serve God by serving your neighbor. You know, love thy neighbor as thyself, all that sort of thing. That's all. If you're doing it with the attitude, not that I'm superior, I've got
Right.
money, so I give to this poor person.
Not as an
Um,
ego ploy.
and I'm going to get lots of punya, I'm going to get lots of merit, and I'm going to go to heaven or whatever, and this wretched fellow is going to go to hell or whatever. If you do it with that attitude, that no. But if you do it with the attitude that it is God in that form that you are serving, that is also a good worship. So
Mm.
Bhagavan, when he gives a definition of worship, he gives a very broad definition. But basically, he says, Ennuru Yabam. That means all the eight forms. The eight forms it's a theological concept in Shaivism. But God has eight forms. The five elements, that means all material things, the sun, the moon, and living beings. So any service, even if you, for example, if you're concerned about the environment, the damage we are doing to the environment and the harm that it's causing to other people and other species, if you try to live a more eco-friendly life, if you consider this is all God's creation, so I shouldn't spoil God's creation, I should take care of it. That can also be, if you do it with the attitude that you're doing that as a service of God, that's also good worship, good worship of God. So Bhagavan gives a very broad definition of worship. But he says, more efficacious than that is Jappa.
Mm.
Jappa means you're repeating a name of God. And when he deals with that, he says, better than singing hymns of praise is Jappa. Better than Jappa done aloud is Jappa done softly within the mouth. Better than Jappa done softly within the mouth is Jappa done mentally. That's a kind of meditation. When he says better, I'm referring here to verses in Upadesha Undya, or Upadesha Saram. When he says better, he means more efficacious in purifying the mind. Because
Mm.
these are all means to purify the mind.
Did he say to use the word Brahman, or you could say the word God, or does it not matter as long as the intention of the word
Well,
is correct?
yeah. I mean, there are two. Sometimes it is. They use terms niguna Brahman and saguna Brahman.
Mm.
Niguna Brahman means Brahman who is beyond all qualities. That's Brahman as he actually is niguna. He's
Mm.
beyond all limitations.
Mm.
But we cannot know that so long as we know ourselves as a form, we cannot know that formless infinite Brahman. The only way to know Brahman is to know ourselves as we actually are. So, there, in our view, Brahman seems to be Saguna. So, Saguna Brahman, that means Brahman with qualities, with limitations or whatever, that is God. So, God is Brahman as he is perceived by us, or conceived by us
Mm. Mhm.
because we cannot adequately conceive of that which is infinite. We can have an idea of God is infinite, God is formless, God is infinite, eternal, immutable, all these things.
But that's
But
all.
these are all concepts, and concepts are mental forms. So we cannot know the real formless nature of God so long as we know ourselves as a form. That's why in Hinduism, God is worshipped in so many forms.
Right.
God is actually the formless Brahman. He's beyond all forms, but we cannot know him as such so long as we know him as a form. So it's appropriate to worship God in form.
Mm.
That's why a lot of worship is worship of the name and form of God.
Right.
That's why Jappa, you're repeating a name of God. It doesn't matter what the name is. Usually, if you're a devotee, I mean, some devotees will happily sing all different names and forms of God. But as the devotion becomes more mature, you tend to, that is all yoga, all spiritual practice is a, is a, is a movement from manyness to oneness, because the ultimate reality is absolute oneness. So the more mature devotion is to one name and form of God. That is what is called in it's called Ishtadeva. That means the beloved God, the chosen God.
Mm.
So for some people, the Ishtadeva is Krishna, some people Rama, some people Hanuman or Shiva or the goddess Devi. There's so many different names and forms. Whatever name and form you choose, that is according to certain names and forms will attract more than others. So, for example, for someone like me who takes Bhagavan as God and Guru and everything, Bhagavan's form is the form that attracts me among all the many forms of God. But that doesn't mean I look down on other forms of God. For me, all the other forms of God, Rama, Krishna, Jesus, Buddha, whatever, all are different manifestations of the same one Bhagavan. As I said, I'm talking about the early verses of Upadesha Undiyar. Bhagavan says, after talking about japa, he then talks about meditation. He said, better than interrupted meditation, uninterrupted meditation is good. The reason is, if we are meditating on God, on a name or form of God, if our meditation is often interrupted by other thoughts, that means we're more concerned about other things than about God. But if our love for Him is more intense, there'll be less interruption. So our meditation will be more interrupted. So the uninterrupted meditation is better. When he said better, again, he means more efficacious in purifying the mind.
And of course, that's
But
very hard to achieve because the mind is always,
yeah, oh yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
Because we all, why is it hard? Because of the Vishaya Vasanas,
right.
because of the inclination to attend to other things. And the inclination to attend to other things, that's the very nature of ego. As ego, we cannot survive as ego without constantly attending to things other than ourselves.
Mm.
So it is the very nature of ego. So these are the impurities. This is what all spiritual practice is, trying to reduce those impurities, to reduce the strength of the Vishaya Vasanas. That's why meditation and things like that, they're effective. If you try and focus your mind on one name and form of God, by holding on to that one name and form, you're reducing the strength of the vasanas to attend to other things.
Mm.
Because the nature of vasanas, as we can see from our own experience, vasanas are just inclinations. We are not bound by our vasanas. So when vasanas arise now, and all mental activity is nothing but a play of vasanas. All the thoughts that arise in our mind are nothing but the vasanas rising up. An example I often give, because it's a very easy example to give. Supposing someone is a habitual smoker. Giving up smoking is difficult. Why is it difficult? Because they've been allowing themselves to be swayed by that inclination, that vasana to smoke. They've been allowing themselves to be swayed by that for so many years. To undo that is difficult. But if they know, that is why most people who smoke try to give up smoking, is because they know it's bad for their health. So they have two inclinations pulling in the opposite direction. One is the inclination to smoke, the other is the inclination not to smoke. If they keep on yielding to that inclination to smoke, they will not be able to give up. But if they decide, no, I must avoid this, and they every time the inclination to smoke arises, they say, no, not now, not now. They put it off. That inclination loses its strength, and the inclination to maintain their health by not smoking gets strengthened. So in any spiritual practice, our aim is to focus the mind on one thing and thereby reduce the strength of the dissipating Vishaya Vasanas. So this is the efficacy of any type of spiritual practice. And of course, devotion, that is, in order to focus on one thing, the devotion or love is a very powerful motivating thing. If you have love for something, supposing someone who is very, very dear to you is critically ill in hospital, whatever you may be doing, in the back of your mind, the thought of your friend, your loved one, will be there in the back of your mind. Are they going to recover? Are they not going to recover? The mind will naturally be dwelling on that because of the love. Love is a very, very powerful motivating thing. So that's the efficacy of this devotion for God as something other than oneself. But God is not actually something other than ourselves. God is the one underlying reality. God is infinite being. So we are, God is our very being. We seem to be separate from God because we identify ourselves with this body. We identify ourselves as this person. But the reality, what we actually are, is nothing but that infinite being that is God. So when the mind is purified, we come to recognize that God is not something other than ourselves, but our own very being. When we understand that, rather than meditating on a name or form of God, we meditate on God as our own being. In other words, we don't think of anything other than ourselves, we attend to ourselves alone. That is what Bhagavan says in the 8th verse, rather than the 8th verse of Upatashundya, says, rather than Anya Bhava, that means meditating on God as something other than ourselves, Ananya Bhava, meditating on as nothing other than oneself, with the understanding that He is I, that is the best among all. When he says best among all, that is the most efficacious means to purify the mind. Not only is it most efficacious means to purify the mind, it is the only means to eradicate ego, which is the root of all impurities. So, and then in the next verse he says, by the strength of that meditation, implying the meditation on oneself alone, being in the state of being, which transcends all bhavana. Bhavana there means mental activity, meditation. If you're meditating on God as something other than yourself, that's a mental activity. Whereas if you attend to ourself, that is a subsidence of mental activity. So being in the state of being, which transcends all mental activity, that is the supreme devotion. To understand this, we need to understand a bit more about Bhagavan's teachings. One thing that he made clear in many places, but particularly clear in verse 25 of Uludunapadu, that's the 40 verses on what is, he says, he describes ego as a formless demon. It's formless because it has no form of its own. But what has no form of its own also has no separate existence. So in its formless state, ego is not ego at all. It comes into being as a separate entity by grasping form. So what he says in that verse is, he puts it very, very compactly. Grasping form, it comes into being. Grasping form, it stands. Grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Leaving form, it grasps form. What he means by that is, when he says grasping form, it comes into being, That is, as soon as we rise as ego, we project a body and experience that body as I. We can see this in dream. As soon as we start dreaming, we experience ourselves as a person, as a body in that dream world. So we cannot experience anything other than ourselves without first experiencing us, without first limiting ourselves as a form. And whatever form we experience as ourselves is a projection. It doesn't actually exist independently. So as soon as we rise as ego, we project and identify the form of a body as I. That's why he said, grasping form, it comes into being. Grasping form, it stands. That is, we cannot remain as ego for a moment without constantly experiencing ourselves as I am this body. Of course, we're not constantly thinking I am this body, but our whole experience, we experience ourselves as this body, and that's the foundation of all our other experiences. And then in the third sentence, he said, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. That is, having identified ourselves with a body, we don't stop with that. We're constantly attending to other phenomena. When he talks about form, he's not just talking about physical form. He's talking in a very broad sense. Any phenomena of any kind whatsoever is a form. It's a limitation. So attending to things other than ourselves is the very food on which we as ego live. And we cannot remain for a moment without constantly attending to things other than ourselves. That's why he says, leaving form, it grasps form. But then in the next sentence, he says, very cryptically, if seeking, it takes flight. What he means by if seeking, if it seeks to know its own reality, if it seeks to know who am I. In other words, if it turns its attention away from all the forms, back towards itself to see who am I, autum pidicum literally means it grasps running. In other words, it runs away. It takes flight. In English, we say take flight. So what he implies by that is, so long as we attend to other things, we are feeding and nourishing ego. But if we turn our attention back towards ourselves, we as ego subside. And if we attend to ourselves keenly enough, we will merge back into our being. That's how we bring about the annihilation of ego. Since such is the nature of ego, the only way to bring about the eradication of ego is by self-attentiveness or self-investigation, atma-vichara. It's often translated as self-inquiry, but this word self-inquiry tends to be a little bit misleading because inquiry tends to imply asking questions. And when people hear the inquiry, who am I? They think they're to sit there asking themselves, who am I? Bhagavan never said, ask who am I? He said, investigate who am I? And he made it clear the way to investigate who am I is to fix our attention on ourselves. To the extent to which we attend to ourselves, to that extent we subside. So attending to anything other than ourselves is a mental activity. Whereas attending to ourselves is a cessation of mental activity, because mental activity is the what is active is as ego we are thinking, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting. So all this activity is the doer of all the actions is ego. But when we turn our attention back towards ourselves, we as ego subside. And when we subside, all our activity subsides along with us. That's why he says in that verse 9 of Upadeshundiya, by the strength of that self-attentiveness, being in the state of being, but transcends all mental activity, that is supreme devotion. That's the very nature of supreme devotion. So in this way, Bhagavan he isn't opposed to other spiritual paths, but he points out how other spiritual paths must eventually lead to this self-investigation. And then he goes on to talk about yoga. Yoga, meaning the classical yoga, the Ashtanga yoga, the
The 8 limbs.
eightfold.
Mm.
What is that is the 8 limbs of yoga are yama and niyama. That's basically all the do's and don'ts. You shouldn't cause harm to others. You shouldn't. It's all the moral and ethical restrictions, which are the very foundation of any type of spiritual practice. So yama and niyama is common to all forms of spiritual practice. Then he says asana. Asana means simply posture. Most meditators sit in meditation, but he doesn't, Patanjali, that is, doesn't dwell, Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutra, he doesn't dwell much on the asana. He just mentioned that. That's one of the limbs. And then the fourth one is pranayama.
Right.
Pranayama is a means for curbing mental activity. And then the next four are is basically withdrawal. You should withdraw your attention from other things. Then dharana. Dharana means focus. You're focusing your mind. Then the focus leads to meditation, which is deep focus. And that leads to samadhi, which is even deeper focus. So all these are common to all spiritual practices except for pranayama. Pranayama is the unique selling point, we can say, of the Ashtanga Yoga. And the aim of Ashtanga Yoga, as Patanjali makes clear from the very beginning, yoga's chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is to curb or reduce or to stop the activity of the mind. That's the basic meaning. The reason that pranayama is used in yoga, it's a means of, because the mind and the breath are very closely connected. If your mind is very agitated, you'll be breathing fast and unevenly. Sometimes if you've had a great shock or something, one way to calm yourself down is to breathe slowly. In fact, they sometimes say to that, if someone's in a state of shock, they say, just breathe slowly. Because it's a way of calming down the mind. So pranayama is there are very elaborate techniques for how many matras. Matras means moments you should breathe out, how many moments you should breathe in, how many moments you should do the retention. It can be quite elaborate, but this is all a means to curb the mental activity. However, as Bhagavan made clear, if you stop the mind or curb the mental activity by means of pranayama, it will work so long as you restrain the breath. As soon as you stop restraining the breath, the mind will come out and start wandering again under the sway of its vasanas. So Bhagavan says, therefore, if this is in Nanar actually, he says this, pranayama is a means to restrain the mind, but it will not bring about manonasa, which means the destruction of mind. So when Bhagavan talks in Upadesha Undiyana, when he talks about pranayama, about yoga, he focuses only on pranayama, because as I said, that's a unique selling point of yoga. And he explains why it's efficacious, but because the mind and breath, they originate from the same source. If you control one, you control the other. If you calm down your mind, the breathing will calm down. If you calm down the breathing, the mind will calm down. So it's an effective means to calm the mind. But then he says in the 13th verse of Upadesha Undiyana, but dissolution of mind is of two kinds, laya and nasa. What is in laya will rise again. What is in nasa will not rise again. Nasa means annihilation, eradication. So sleep, for example, is a state of manolaya. We fall asleep because we're too tired to continue our mental activity. So out of tiredness, we fall asleep. There are other types of manolaya. For example, if you're going to have a major surgery or be given general anesthesia, that is a drug-induced manolaya. You can bring about manolaya by means of pranayama. That is what they usually call samadhi. But these are all just temporary dissolution of mind. They're not permanent. In order to bring about the permanent dissolution of mind, the only means is self-investigation. Because only by self-investigation you're cutting at the very root of arising. That is, as I said earlier, ego is a false awareness of ourselves. As ego, we're always aware of ourselves as I am this body, I am this person, I am Mark, I am Michael, or whoever. So that is a wrong identification, because this body, this person is not what we actually are. The mistaken awareness of ourselves, the awareness of ourselves as something other than what we actually are, can be removed only by correct awareness of ourselves. In other words, only by being aware of ourselves as we actually are, can we eradicate ego. Just like if you see a rope and mistake it to be a snake, the only way to remove that illusion that it's a snake is to look at it very carefully. If you look at it very carefully, you say, oh, it never was a snake, it was only just a rope. Likewise, if we look at ourselves carefully enough, we will see ourselves as we actually are, which is as the infinite being, awareness, happiness, love, Satchidananda, that we actually are. And thereby uh, we will eradicate this false identification. So the only means to eradicate ego is to be aware of ourselves as we actually are. And in order to be aware of ourselves as we actually are, we need to attend to ourselves. Bhagavan says in the 14th verse, the mind which will subside by restraining the breath, only when that mind is sent on the investigating path will its form die. He uses a very terse word for investigating path. He says, or vari. Or can be interpreted in two ways. Or can mean one. So it can mean only if the mind is sent on the one path. But or is also the root of a verb that means to know or investigate. So it means the investigating path. In other words, the path of self-investigation. So in this pranayama, it's an effective means to calm the mind. And if you take it far enough, you can go into samadhi and remain in samadhi for any amount of time. But that's not our aim, because sooner or later the mind's going to rise again, and all the vasanas, just like when we wake up from sleep, the same vasanas that were there the previous day are going to rise again. We can't get rid of, we can't weaken vasanas in a state of laya. So it's only in the waking state that we can curb these outward going inclinations. So other spiritual practices like bhakti and yoga and the path of karma, nishkarmiya karma, desireless action, that is the preliminary stages of the path of bhakti. That is, we begin bhakti trying to express our love for God through the three instruments, mind, speech, and body. So expressing our love through body is called puja, worship. Expressing it through speech is called jappa. Expressing it through mind is called dhyana. These are all activities. But if you're doing these for the love of God and not for the fulfillment of any desires, then that is nishkarmiya karma. So that's what's called karma yoga. People think karma yoga is doing. Karma yoga is not doing. It is the attitude with which you do. That is, we're all engaged in activities. So long as we so long as we take ourselves to be this bundle of five sheaves, the so-called body-mind complex, we are always active. That is, this body, we need to be active to feed the body and to take care of the body. And we are social creatures, so we exchange, we talk, and so there's vocal activity. And the mind, of course, is always active. So these it's not the actions that make it karma yoga. It's the doing the actions not for the fulfillment of any desires, but just for the love of God. That's what makes it karma yoga. So karma yoga is the preliminary stages of the path of bhakti. So long as you're expressing your love for God through any action of mind, speech, or body, speech, or mind, that is nishkarmiya karma. The advanced stage of the bhakti, path of bhakti, is when you cease doing anything, just turn your mind within and thereby subside. That is surrender. So that's a more advanced stage of bhakti. So the path of self-investigation, atma-vichara, is people often think Bhakti Marga and Jnana Marga, the path of devotion and the path of knowledge, they're two different paths. Bhagavan makes it clear the path of knowledge, the path of self-investigation, is the advanced stages of the path of devotion. Bhagavan often used to say, Bhakti is the mother of jnana. Devotion is the mother of knowledge. That is, the nature of ego is to have vasanas. And the vasanas are the seeds that give rise to all these likes, dislikes, desires, attachments, and so on. That is the force that drives the mind outwards, why we're constantly going outwards. So, in order to know ourselves as we actually are, we need to give up those out, or reduce to a considerable extent the inclination to go outwards in order to develop the love to go back within. So that love to go back within, that is the pinnacle of the path of devotion. Because so long as we are attending to anything outside, even if it's a name and form of God, it's still something for the mind to cling to. Whereas when we turn our attention within, that brings about the subsidence of mind. It's there in Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 6. Krishna talks so much about this, fixing the mind. In verse 25, he says, Atma samstam manakritva, na kinchitapi chintayat. Fix the mind on oneself, on Atman. Do not think of anything else. And in a few verses earlier, in verse 18, he defines what is yukta. Yukta, that is the word yoga, means to yoke. People often talk of yoga as if it's union with God. It can be taken in that sense, but that's not the main meaning of yoga. The main meaning of yoga is yoke. Yoke is it's used in much the same way that we use in English the term harness.
Mm.
That is, if you yoke bullocks, you're harnessing them. You're bringing them under control. So it's that harnessing of the mind that is called yoga. So in other words, stopping the mind going the way it wants to go and harnessing it. So that's yoga. So what Krishna says there is, I can't remember the exact words, but it's something to the effect, keeping the mind on self alone or in self alone, that alone is yukta. Yukta is a past participle of the same root. That is, the verb is yuj. Yuj means to yoke. Yoga is one form of that word. Yukta is another form. So yukta implies the accomplishment of yoga. So the end of yoga is to keep the mind always on oneself. These teachings are there in the ancient texts, but Bhagavan has given a fresh emphasis to this core teaching of self-investigation, and he's clarified it in so many ways.